to our second 2019 Authors on the Hill lecture with Professor Mulrooney. We are very pleased to welcome you to this event, and today Professor Mulrooney will talk to us about his recent publication, Romanticism and Theatrical Experience. This book was recently published by Cambridge University Press, and the campus bookstore is here selling copies of the book should you like to purchase one.
They're only $90.
After the presentation, please enjoy some food in the back and consider filling out a feedback survey form for us so we can better understand what other events you'd like us to host here within the libraries. So now, without further ado, I present to you Professor Mulrooney.
Thanks for asking me to do this. It's a pleasure to be here and see so many of my students, former students as well, and faculty and staff. I appreciate you all coming out. Laura said I was to talk for 45 minutes, but I thought it was 4.5, so the talk will be a little bit shorter than maybe expected. I actually distilled this entire book onto this, I'm not kidding you. So this is the talk, this is the book. I will try to make this approximate what's going on here, we shall see. So we've already had our theatrical glitch. I guess we started a little bit late, but oh well. All right, so when I say romantic poetry, maybe this is for the students, right? When I say romantic poetry, oh, by the way, here's my family in the front row, so thank you to them, A, for coming. I always ignore my students in the front row, so I don't see who's sitting there, so I said no. But these two little girls, now not little, were not born when I started writing this book, so it tells you how long it took me to write it. And Grace and Anna. And their mom house when you're here, so it's wonderful to have them. So when I say romantic poetry, what do you think about? Students. Clara, you think?
I think about Byron, Shelley.
Okay.
Movement that would look to nature as a mirror for the emotional turmoil within the soul of man.
Yep.
But I also think about cheap romance novels.
Okay, right, there's that as well.
Holy Cross cannot completely socialize me out of.
Right, nor should they. Those reading practices are important. So, I mean, romance can mean a lot of different things over the course. And the Romantics didn't call themselves Romantics. That was sort of made up later on in the Victorian and in the modernist era, sort of retroactively calling them Romantics because they were engaged with the genre of romance, not so much Harlequin romance and so forth, but Harlequin does actually come into my talk a little bit. So Byron and Shelley, they used to call them the Big Six when I was an undergrad, right? Byron, Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, Blake, Coleridge. Anything you notice about all six of those people? They're all male, right? They're all, in some measure, lyric poets. And so principally over the last several hundred years, Romanticism has been associated with lyric poems, right? Poems written by a singular person to an audience, often expressive of emotion, engagement with nature, and so forth. So for a really, really long time, it wasn't even that people didn't think about theater and Romanticism in the same way, or in the same breath. It was that Romanticism was judged. Sort of the index of Romantic poetry was how far it was away from these sort of very communal, very social, very theatrical ways of experiencing the world. And so part of what happened to me when I started this project many, many years ago was that I was involved in a theater company. I'd always been involved in theater. It was really important to me. And I kind of wanted to find a way to bring that into my scholarly work, which was focused on lyric poetry. And so bringing these two things together, and Keats, as most of you who are in this room know, is sort of my main man. And I sort of started reading a lot of his not only poems, but letters, and so forth, and I started to realize how much he actually wrote about going to the theater, thinking about the theater, thinking about a particular actor that I'm going to talk about today named Edmund Kean. And I sort of backwards came into this project because I started thinking about, well, what was Keats doing? What was he reading? And I went and found tons and tons of theatrical periodicals, and I discovered, sort of almost by accident, just by kind of diving into the archives, that after the turn of the century, which is to say after 1800, there was this absolute explosion in the number of magazines, periodicals, journals, etc., devoted to theater. Now this was accompanied by an explosion in newspapers, and other kinds of print media, but there's a kind of particular force to the ways in which people started feeling like writing about theater was really important. So I got myself and found myself back in the theatrical city in early 19th century London. And I sort of joke the project started as a project about Romanticism, then it became a project about late Romanticism or second generation Romanticism, and then it became a project about the 1820s, and eventually it ended up being like about 1 week in 1820, right? So this is a very sort of specific historical moment, because I wanted to kind of do the slice of life about the ways in which people were thinking about theater, and the ways ultimately that it affected a poet as lyric as Keats. Nobody really thinks about, well, hopefully now they do, but nobody really thinks about theater and Keats in the same breath. So there has been a lot of work recently in the last 20 years or so to try to look back at the Romantic period and think about what was happening in the theater. And so one of the things, a lot of the things that we've discovered, the most important things we've discovered are that it became a central cultural experience for people living in the city and even around the country. And in some ways, what I'm doing is not focusing so much on theater, but on its reception, how people wrote about it and they read about it. So to do that, I had to go into newspaper archives, periodical archives, and I'm going to show you a little bit today about what I found, just a kind of overview to give you a sense of, I'm doing what I do in class. I come into class with notes and I never look at them, and I always go in different directions. So, what do I mean by theatrical experience? I mean an experience of theater as a viewer, as a reader. Increasingly, theater became important to people who never even set foot in playhouses. The playhouses burned down in the late 18th century. They were built up until there was 3,000 people seeing nightly theater productions. The other piece to know is that at this time the government got really involved because they were very threatened by these cultural events, because theater was a place where spectacle was really prominent and it sort of revved the crowds up. So what's going on in France at this time is the French Revolution, and the crowds are getting revved up by theatrical events resulting in the guillotine. So the British government was like, no, there are only 2 theaters in London, and there's a longer history of this, but there are only 2 theaters in London that could do spoken theater, spoken drama. And it was Drury Lane and Covent Garden. They had special patents from the king. And all the other theaters had to focus on representations that were not verbal. So it was pantomime, here's where Harlequin comes in, right? It was burlesque, it was burletta, it was music, right? And these were sort of lower forms that people flocked to, and they started to take on this kind of political valence, or this political effect, where people were writing about them and saying, don't go here, go here. Because in these 2 theaters, you can watch Shakespeare. In these 2 theaters, you can watch Sheridan. In these 2 theaters, you can watch the cultural legacy of what we want Britain to be. Meanwhile, what's going on over here is rubbish, okay? But then what happens is that these patent theaters start noticing the money that's being made over here, and they start saying, let's start to import some of these techniques into our plays. And so this is kind of the moment that we step into in the book. Okay. This is the book cover. This is me, by the way, right here. Right? So I wanted this so desperately, this painting, and it was held by Getty Images, and they wanted $3,000 for it, or something absurd like that. But it was also held in the Dunhill archive. Now, Dunhill, if you don't know, is a sort of accessories store. You know, they sell kind of men's accessories, cigars, fancy stuff in London that British men use. So I went onto the Dunhill retail site and I hit their little chat box. They're the one that's like, hey, let us help you buy a suit. And I was like, hi, I'm a scholar. I would really like to use this painting that you have in your archive. And I got a little chat back, 3 dots, and the woman said, hi, my name's Rachel, here's my email, and within an hour I had permission to use this for free, right? So then I bought a really expensive Dunhill bag to say thank you to them. So anyway, right, exactly. But what you can see here is essentially the book as a whole. This is a painting by John Parry from 1835 called The Postman. And you can even see this in London today, or Paris, or Dublin, or any of these cities that have theatrical advertisements, and you can see this sort of layering, right? The next day goes on the next day, goes on the next day. So this is 5 layers deep. You got a pickpocket over here, you have soldier, you have some kind of sales going on over here, there's some kind of questionable ladies here. So we're in this sort of alley. You can see St. Paul's in the background. I mean, there's no real perspective in terms of depth except for the posters going up. There's flea circuses. I mean, 85% of this is all theatrical stuff. And that, what I was calling before, that sort of low-end stuff, illegitimate. So this is the theatrical city in which the writers that I'm talking about in the book lived and moved. This is a 1809 front page of the Times newspaper. This is one of the archives that I sort of dove deeply into. What do you notice about this? If you think about newspapers that we see today, or the image of newspapers that you see on the web, right? Here's a more specific question. What's missing from this that you might see in today's New York Times or Wall Street Journal? Pictures, for sure.
Headlines.
Yes, we're pre-photography. What?
Headlines.
Headlines, exactly. So these are all actually pretty much classified ads. The Times of London, the Times itself, held this form until 1930. Okay, they didn't have headlines until well into the 20th century. Because, here's the thing, the newspaper was a commercial enterprise. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because theater was also a commercial enterprise, and it was advertised in these pages. So there'd be a thing like, I lost my wallet, I'm looking for a babysitter, here's the theatrical bill for the day at Drury Lane. And as in the 19th century, sort of the discourse of reporting, like that we know about objective reporting, started to come up. Theater was in both. It was advertised, it was witnessed, and then it was reported on. And it was really one of the only cultural events that had that status. You would have reports on war, but you didn't really know what was going to happen on Thursday. You had to write about what happened on Wednesday, right? And you have advertisements that are like, in the future, I'd like you to come to my book talk or whatever. Theater was both. It was both a future event, hey, come to this performance, and something that happened. Hey, this is what happened last night. So people really became attracted to writing and reading about theater as a kind of daily event, even if they weren't going to the theater. So, let's see. Yeah. This is an actor named Edmund Kean, who's really the centerpiece of the book. The first two chapters of the book are all about that archival work. And it's crazy. The way that people wrote reviews were not like the kinds of reviews that we see today. They were, well, let's see. This one crazy guy says, this is a theatrical review. Full of our critical importance and self-created dignity, attendant on our new avocation, we dined full 2 hours earlier, he's telling us what he had for dinner, that we might be thereby enabled to procure an enviable seat on the critic's bench. He goes on, talks about how he hates all the other people in the theater. On arriving at our destination, we took our station near the door, and in a very few minutes, a pretty considerable damn number of persons arrived till we began to groan and sweat beneath this accumulating pressure and continual monotonous cry of, take care of your pockets, etc. And he describes the evening. He goes on and on and on, amidst catscalls, whistling, Tom, where are you? Love you, Sarah. And the curtain rose and discovered Mrs. Bunn in the character of Elvira. So it's like at the end of the review, he actually gets to the performance. It's all about what's going on in the theatrical scene. So this busyness gives way to different kinds of acting to try to kind of make their way through this noise. And in 1814, along comes this guy, Edmund Kean. Edmund Kean, this is a caricature of him. But he learned his trade in those illegitimate theaters, pantomime. He sort of gesture in ways that communicated to the people way in the back of the theater. And he debuted at Drury Lane, and the crowds loved him. And this is an oversimplification, but initially the critics hated him. He's ruining everything. Because previously, actors would sort of come out, and they were very senatorial, and they would give sort of almost these classical orations. And John Philip Kemble was the great precursor to Kean, and he would come out and he would sort of stand like this. It's almost like the teapot school of acting. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but yes, to be or not to be, etc. And Kean came out, and he was rapid, and he was emotional, and he was overwrought, and he was pantomimic, and the critics did not know what to make of him. And this is a character that really is a criticism of Drury Lane. He's standing on Shakespeare in Richard III, which was his signature role. He was also like small. They didn't like him because he wasn't He was like Tom Cruise, too small to actually be a movie star, but he couldn't stand on anything, to hide it. And then here's Drury Lane on his back. So they're basically like, you're making money off of this guy who's standing on Shakespeare. It's disgusting, all right? So Kean gets himself into trouble, though, because he was an absolute wild man. And we can see this in our own culture today, right? So the attraction, particularly to male rock stars or male movie stars who, the Johnny Depp kind of thing or whatever. You can go up and down, and we were talking about this in class the other day, about sort of the representation of masculinity. And Kean was the greatest celebrity of the age except for Byron, possibly. And in some ways he was even more popular and more interesting to crowds than Byron. He has an affair with, alas, a city alderman's wife. Not the smartest move ever. And in the midst of this, all of these caricatures start coming out. So here's the cuckolded city alderman, whose name unfortunately was Cox. And so you have Kean and Cox, and they're going to have a fun time with that, right? So here's Kean in his signature role. He's sort of effeminized. He's sitting on the lap of his mistress. They're quoting Shakespeare to each other. And this just goes on and on and on, right? A couple others. This is in the court. So this is what's called criminal conversation. It's essentially adultery. And Kean is brought up on charges for this. And so it's all public. The letters, there's this one day where he wrote a letter to the man and he said, "We are friends. I can't believe all this nonsense. It's just rubbish. Let's continue to be friends." And the same day he writes to his mistress and he says, "I just wrote a bunch of bullshit to your husband. Pretend like when you read it that and then they get a hold of these, they publish this." It's like all this stuff that we do with, what is it, TMZ and all, it was going on way back then. These are all media events. So here we have another representation of he wants money from this guy, and the defense is always, in criminal conversation, the husband knew he was pimping out his wife. So these are the kinds of things that are going on, and meanwhile the critics are being like, wait, what's happening to Shakespeare right now? Oh my God. Well, here's what's happening to Shakespeare, because again, here he is as Richard III. Not dressed as Edmund Kean, dressed as Richard III. And here is a still. Of course it's a still. There he is as Richard III. Here's Richmond, at the end of the play, Richard III. So you can see the ways in which this kind of stuff makes its way back and forth between the courts and the theaters. Courts become theater, theater become courts. And Kean had a really hard time when he came back after a hiatus. There were riots because there were people who felt it's immoral for him to be on the stage. How can he be representing Shakespeare? Like as if all Shakespeare's characters are moral, I don't know. But and there was this kind of constant tension. So in the center of all this, Theatrical City is this sort of radiation of sexuality, questions about masculinity, questions about the ways in which the cultural legacy of the nation is at stake. These, you can see them side by side here. Court caricature, serious representation of what's going on in the theater. This is another caricature. And this sort of gets back to sort of the wheelhouse of the book, which is the reception of these things in print, how people wrote about them. These are all journals, all these hydras and monsters, the Old Times, Cant, Malignity, like all these sort of things that are spleening, the New Times. And in this one, Kean's the hero, right? He's holding up Shakespeare, he has a sword, he's defending Shakespeare against the press. So the press are going back and forth over whether Kean is a malignant force or whether he's a hero, and into this city steps John Keats. So I'm skipping over part of the book, which is about a critic named William Hazlitt, who was himself one of the lone voices. He became the preeminent theatrical critic, not arguably of the century, and he was also a absolutely relentless and ethical intellectual who wrote all sorts of essays about politics, culture. I mean, he's one of my heroes, and he's one of the most underread people in all of English literature. And he wrote and lectured on Kean. And he fought against people who were saying Kean was denigrating Shakespeare. And he said, no, actually, he's making us feel Shakespeare differently. He's making us understand that Shakespeare isn't just this senatorial presentation of ideals, but an enactment of real feeling and of brokenness and of pain and of different kinds of ways of being a man. And John Keats was born in 1795. He's 19 when Kean debuts. He goes to Hazlitt's lectures, he reads Hazlitt's lectures, he reads Hazlitt's reviews of Kean, and he starts to become really interested in Kean. Now, I offer this painting of Keats. It's one of the most famous paintings of him because it is a sort of quintessential, to go back to Clara's point, although you didn't mention Keats, but Byron, Keats, Shelley, etc. Here he is. He's reading. And actually, if you go to the Keats house, they have the chairs set up just like this. My kids have done this. They sit in these chairs. Take a picture of yourself. And in the background there, you see Shakespeare. So my contention is that it isn't just Keats to Shakespeare. It's Keats through Hazlitt to Kean to Shakespeare. So our Keats, whom we read as a lyric poet, is actually a theatrical poet. These two things are not at odds. And I'll give you a quick example. This is a famous letter that Keats wrote in 1817. It's one of his most famous passages in all of his letters, in which he talks about a thing called negative capability. What he means by negative capabilities, he says at the end here, is when, he says man, when man is capable of being in, not just having, being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Okay? So it's not about certainty. It's about dwelling in, that thing in the Holy Proposition statement about being patient with ambiguity. It doesn't go far enough. It's not about being patient with ambiguity. It's about dwelling in ambiguity. Because guess what? Most of our lives are going to be ambiguous. It's not just either or all the time. So it's not just, don't be patient with ambiguity until it resolves. Abide in it. That's what I say to my students all the time, and my kids. So here's the passage at the end of the letter. He's talking about his friends. Brown and Dilke walked with me and back from the Christmas pantomime. I had not a dispute but a disquisition with Dilke. Keats was always very, very keen in terms of how he described his interactions with his friends. Not a dispute, but a disquisition. And on various subjects, several things dovetailed in my mind. And at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. Possessed, something negative. I mean negative capability. And there's the definition. Now what's further interesting about this, which I will not belabor you with today, is that the first half of the letter is all about him and Edmund Kean. And he's at a dinner party, and these snobs are sort of looking down on Keats because he wasn't as educated as they were. Bizarre. But, I mean, he translated the Aeneid. So, in grammar school or something. But there was this sort of class system, and Keats was sort of denigrated in ways that were similar to Kean. And Keats writes at the beginning of that letter, they said, they were making fun of Kean and his low company. Would I were in that company rather than yours, said I to myself. He's like, this dinner party sucks. I wish I were hanging out with him. And then the rest of the letter brings us to Keats's most famous distillation of what the Romantic poet does, this notion of negative capability. So what I'm sort of kind of, in a pugilistic way, trying to argue, Keats was a boxer too, I'm not a boxer, that was also Keats. What I'm trying to do is to take that kind of pristine notion of the quiet male reading, solipsistic, solitary, lonely, emotional, romantic poet, and try to, in a way, bring it to theatrical life. And so I wanted to go into the very heart of what Keats is known for, which is negative capability and which is lyric poetry, and claim that as theatrical. So I remember when I was first kind of writing this chapter, and I thought, I need to find the poem that everyone thinks is the least theatrical poem on earth that Keats wrote, and claim that it's theatrical. This is how I'm going to make my point. So I went directly to Ode on a Grecian Urn, and I'm going to give you a little taste of this. I won't give you the whole reading, but so this is stanza 3 of Ode on a Grecian Urn, and the critics have never liked it. They've always thought he goes astray here. Okay, so for those of you who don't know the poem, it's basically a speaker who's trying to make sense of an ancient urn, and he uses mythology, uses different ways to imagine the urn. And there are so many different ways to kind of approach this poem. But there has been a prevailing understanding that comes out of what we call new critical readings in the middle part of the 20th century that suggests that it is this sort of philosophical and kind of almost, what I want to say, intellectual process by which Keats tries to come to terms with the urn. And at the end, the most famous line from all of Keats' poetry, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know. So it's this sort of quintessential romantic moment. But critics have often, beginning with Cleant Brooks, all the way down through yesterday, have said, like, what is going on with this? And if you just read, I have my students read this aloud, right? Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, because he's looking at the picture on the urn. Nor ever bid the spring adieu, and happy melodies, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love. Okay, I'll stop right there. Right? If I were an editor, I'd be like, no, 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 we don't need really 5. We don't really need 5 or 6 happies, right? We've got it, right? Repetitive, overwrought, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting, and forever new, forever new, forever young. So here's my point. My point is that in some way what Keats is doing with his very poetic lines is actually in dialogue with and influenced by Kean's acting style. In other words, the bodily becomes part of what we usually think of as this sort of intellectual lyric exercise. And if you actually read the thing aloud, what does it make you do? Happy, happy, happy. I mean, it's just a sort of little trick, but the reality is that stanza 3, which is commonly derided as the worst stanza in the poem, is actually, for my money, the moment when the poem turns, because it actually becomes more about the body of the speaker and ultimately the reader, if you're reading it aloud, than about the urn. And the dialogue with the urn isn't just about to intellectualize what its history is or to think about it, it's to experience it here. So this is just one small example, but I work my way through a number of Keats's poems, and I talk about what I call the Poetics of interruption. And I say that constantly he's interrupting his own thoughts. Constantly he's giving us poetic figures which go to a different one, go to a different one, go to a different one. And that relentlessness is a product of the theatrical city. And then I kind of quit, because the book was already too long. But the reality is that we could go to Shelley, we could go to Byron, or we could go to Felicia Hemans, or we could go to all sorts of poets that are working at this time and see them in ways that put pressure on our own understanding of what lyric poetry is, how it should be taught, how our students should understand it. And in the end, the kind of real takeaway is I want Romanticism to return to the body. And I wanted, this is great to stay at a Catholic, teach at a Catholic school, right? And to try to understand Romanticism more largely as something that is as engaged with the lived life of the city as it is with nature, solitude, the sublime, and so forth. Let's see. So, in the end, kind of the book is really just an intervention into not so much theatrical history, not so much lyric history, not so much Romanticism, but a little bit of all three. And what the goal was is really to try and reach, this is why it's $90, because libraries buy it, professors. This is what we do. This is what professors do when we talk to each other. It's not quite the same thing as when we talk to you, but we talk to each other and we challenge each other to think in new ways about these texts. I'm not going to come into my class, my students here who have taught, with whom I've discussed Keats, probably don't know or aren't exposed to all the things that I just kind of laid out for you, but they are exposed to this sort of distilled reading of that poem that I've learned from spending time in these archives and from arguing and discussing with my colleagues. So the talk today, especially for the students, isn't just to sort of give you a different view of Romanticism, but also to give you a different view of what it is your professors are doing when they're not on campus, right? And similarly, I see Rob in the background. The scientists are out there doing science in the world as well. But one of the virtues of teaching in a place like Holy Cross is that it's always connected. And you guys don't hear this a lot, but we have this kind of notion to which we all adhere here, which is the teacher-scholar. And that a lot of universities, it's not the reality. It's one or the other. And I can say with almost no exceptions, all of my colleagues adhere to and exemplify that value and that figure. So you guys are lucky to be here for that reason. Forget about the tuition for a second, right? All the other reasons why this college is problematic, but that's pretty cool. So anyway, so that gives you a sense of things, and I'm happy to take questions if people have them or not, and we can just eat. But thanks for coming. Looking forward to
question. So you talked a little bit about how this sort of sex scandal came out and kind of, embarrassed this guy and made him kind of, disappear for a while. Like what generally was the response at the time you're talking about to, like infusing poetry and theater, classics like Shakespeare, sort of situating those in terms of sexuality? Was it a repressor? Was this starting to be talked about?
It depends on to whom you speak, right? So the Regency period, sort of the early part of the 19th century, is really interesting in this question. This sort of school, I guess you could call it, so the group that Keats was affiliated with became known as the Cockney School because it was sort of seen as a London city, and they were super questionable. It was like, what's going on over here? Free love, they're constantly this incestuous. So his mentor was named Leigh Hunt, and he published a version of what's called the Story of Rimini, which is Paolo and Francesca, takes it right out of Dante, but he rewrites Dante in some really interesting ways, and he got hammered. They were like this incestuous league of poets that's trying to bring down, our moral fabric of Britain. Similar kind of debates that we see today between the right and the left. So in a lot of ways, there were people pushing for liberation. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft is writing at the end of the 18th century, and William Godwin and other writers who are really pushing for women's equality, and still working on that. But and then there were others who were reactionary. Probably the simplest answer is that Britain was in a reactionary period here, but the fact that it was in a reactionary period suggests that there was something to react to. And there was this sort of lived reality on the ground. Whenever you see this sort of oppression or obfuscation or lying from a government or an administration or whatever you want to say, that means that there are real things going on the ground that they're afraid of. And so it's an interesting dynamic to think about in our own moment on our hill. Yes?
I thought the story of the critic was very interesting, right? And to hear about very much the critic putting themselves into the story.
Oh yeah.
Sounds like a lot of what we're hearing is actually more about their evening than what the play was.
Yeah, exactly.
So where did those critics fit into society at that time? Were these public figures where to some degree someone would be reading this to know what this person's doing?
Yeah.
Or are these people trying to insert themselves?
That's such a great question. There's variations on the theme. A lot of these were sort of fairly middle class or even upper class kids who were bored, who wanted to sort of start a journal, and they talked to each other back and forth. The only phenomenon equally dramatic to the formation of all these periodicals was their disappearance. So that was a journal called the Theatrical Mince Pie, and it lasted for a year and a half. There were others the Theatrical Observer, which mimicked newspapers and copied them and was in dialogue with those, was 150 years. There are some that are still running. It is a moment where you have the emergence of the professional literary critic, the professional theatrical critic. So the one man that I mentioned briefly, William Hazlitt, started as a parliamentary reporter for the Morning Chronicle. And he had such good memory for dialogue that he could verbatim reproduce the speeches, because you weren't allowed to take notes or anything like that. And he moved from that to theatrical criticism, and he made a living doing that. That was his profession, was to be a critic. That became more possible with the advent of all these different venues, but a lot of them didn't have a lot of money. But when you get to the Times and the Edinburgh Review and all these other kind of more prominent journals, there were people that were aristocrats writing for them, or people that weren't doing it for a living. But this is the moment where the sort of professional, Melissa would probably, Professor Schoenberg would probably count it earlier, but this is a moment where the sort of professional man of letters or person of letters, even women, but then women writing in the public sphere was always deeply problematic, and that's some of the stuff that goes on with this criminal conversation trial. Women could not defend themselves because to speak in public was to mark yourself as a whore, right? I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but so yeah, it's a really interesting moment for that kind of issue. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have a related question about kind of the status, the public status of poetry in all this. So theater is a very contested, kind of controversial status. What about poetry? I mean, you refer to the Cockney School and this kind of stratification within poetry. So is some of that, kind of theatrical dirt rubbing off on Keats's poetry? Is that?
Yes, I mean,
stratification?
I'm sort of making a fundamental claim that it's not only rubbing off, but it's shaping his objectivity, that it's shaping his sense of his own interiority, his own feelings, his own thoughts, and so forth. But poems were circulated publicly in newspapers. They were politically aligned. Where a poem was published mattered a lot. Part of the reason that Keats gets hammered is that he's publishing in Leigh Hunt's journal, The Examiner. Leigh Hunt writes an article called Young Poets in which he lists these young poets, and then the Blackwoods Journal, which is a conservative journal, attacks all those young poets. Famously says about Keats, who was a medical student, go back to the apothecary, use soporifics there, not in your damn stupid poetry, that kind of thing. Often it's gendered. Keats and others were sort of kind of denigrated as effeminate poets and so forth. So we've as you well know, we've extracted all this stuff, put it in anthologies, and we give it to our students, and we say, to autumn, season of mist and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, etc. But there's a politics to that. And so some of what I'm trying to do is coming out of probably the last 20 or 30 years of scholarship that's trying to reclaim the political context for these poems and view them as public documents. But I'm also pushing back against that, because one of the excesses to that way of thinking about poetry is that it turns poems, if you push it too far, into, strictly speaking, historical documents. And I want to think about the question of subjectivity and the question of how a poet represents his or her interiority as not only a product of, but an answer to and shaping those other public conversations. So yes, for someone in my field, it's impossible to think about poetry at this point as not both public and private and reshaping both of those. I don't know if that's a good, yeah, please.
So you said you started off writing about Romanticism. It ended up being about a week. And
Yeah.
It sounds like this is a week that changed everything for Romanticism.
Right.
But I'm wondering, did this week also have an impact on the theater, legitimate or no? Are you also making the case that there was an impact of Romanticism on the stage?
I mean, here's the secret. I don't know that I believe in Romanticism per se anymore, right? In the sense of I mean, this is a collection of, what's that? Right, yeah. This is a collection of texts, engagements, ways of thinking, poems, newspaper, all of these things, which we then put in a box and say, Romanticism. But I think that the conversations, I don't think Keats had much of an effect on the theater. He wrote one play called Otto the Great, which was never produced. He tried to write another one called King Stephen, which is, only 2.5 scenes. Wordsworth tried to write a play that was never produced. Byron was quite successful. He was on the board at Drury Lane, And so there are lots of cross currents and ways in which, I think Byron would probably be the best example here, because his poems changed the way that some theatrical productions were putting themselves on stage, because he was so famous and so engaged as both a playwright and a board member and a lyric poet, if we could call it that. But the sort of, and Hazlitt certainly as a critic changes the way people think about acting and makes possible, I mean, I think you could trace a through line from Hazlitt's criticism, because he's trying to take that moment, that crazy moment, and say, okay, I want to think about the way this is affecting me and how I think about myself as a human being. It's not just about what's going on stage. And that radiates through 19th century drama into modernism, right? And into the ways that we think about, sort of all the theatrical scenes that we see in 19th century novels, again and again and again. But again, my interest is also in things that don't appear to be theatrical that are. So I'm not a theater historian, and a theater historian would have a better answer in terms of the ways that sort of production values changed as a result of some of these discourses. But certainly there's constant conversation back and forth. Yes. Anything else? Going once, going through that.
I don't know if this is like a comment or a question, but I mean, thinking about the 18th century, I mean, what's so kind of interesting about this is it breaks down that kind of alleged barrier where you have the kind of very publicly oriented poetry of the 18th century with all these different voices, right? And it kind of works against this narrative that there is a kind of inward turn or a lyric turn in thinking. If there's something, so even if the Ode on the Grecian Urn is kind of dramatizing how you're thinking about it, that it's actually much more alignable with 18th century poetry.
Yes, exactly. This is why you're cheering when I said like I don't believe in Romanticism. I think that the sort of classical thing was like Romanticism pushes back and overturns like the dry 18th century. It doesn't work that way, right? And the theatrical through line is, 18th century scholars I think have long had more interest in drama than Romantic scholars. Like just sort of after Sheridan, it just sort of drops off, right? And even Professor Castleman was saying like, there's this gap in theatrical history where you have the 18th century and then you have the 19th century and then Romanticism is in the middle. And that's our own fault as Romanticists. We weren't paying attention to this stuff. So yeah, I think, here's the way I would put it. I think there's as much difference in the way that Keats is representing and thinking about his own self and his own expressive self. There's as much difference between that, Keats and Wordsworth, as there is between Wordsworth and Poe. Right? And so I think I sort of eschew this notion that there's sort of Romanticism is like, and I think a lot of people in both of our fields would acknowledge that and embrace that way of thinking at this point. So, but theater is a way in, right? This is the ultimate takeaway, I hope, from the book. Like, theater and theatrical experience are not a way out of lyric, they're a way into it, and vice versa. So that we can see the ways in which these kind of powerful ways of imagining ourselves are always talking to each other. So, that's probably it. Thanks for coming again.
Thank you all for attending, and please take some food. We have a lot left over, and if you can, please leave us some feedback on the survey. Thank you.
Thank you.